All right, let's look at this particular lesson, which is about the persecution of the church. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, the the persecutions that came in the first 3 centuries actually was going to strengthen a lot of Christians, as you can imagine. It would be strengthening to the church in many ways, but at the same time, it is the catalyst that brought in a lot of error, a lot of mistakes. And some of it is very natural because, I say natural, it's something you can understand how they would go that way because of what would take place. Just as an illustration, you know, if you have a family member that was murdered for Christ and then I denied the faith in the same persecution, and then afterwards I came back and said, well, please take my membership back, and you just lost perhaps your husband or your wife who had been murdered, then you might have a little second thought about, oh, well, Bill denied the faith. Now he wants to come back. And it might be a little tough. You can see how that would be hard. Consequently, sometimes the churches put up a little bit more barriers to come back in. So that was just one of the many areas, but that would be very difficult to do. And that's one of the things that did happen. So we'll see how that plays out. But first of all, let's look at these are the classes we've looked at already. Propagation of Christianity last week. So now we're looking at the persecutions, and I have them under 3 different heads. There are 3 different persecutions, or 3 different streams of persecuting powers against the church. Number 1 is the persecution by the Jews. This is so ignored by history, so ignored by the historians, and so ignored by modern day commentators. It's almost as if there's never been a persecution of the church or Christians by Jews, but there has been so heavy persecution by Jewish people in history. And that is so clear, not only in the New Testament itself, but we'll look at the rebellion of Bar Kokhba for just a moment. He was at Jamnia, or there was an enclave of Jews in Jamnia. I say Jamnia, that may be not the right pronunciation, Jamnia, but it was about 135 AD. Bar Kokhba, we'll talk about that in a moment. Then there was, of course, the persecution that came by means of the Roman Empire. And that is just going to trace itself all the way through 3 centuries. Some of the emperors were heavy in persecution, some of them were not. But it did have a lasting effect upon the churches. And then we'll notice persecution, just briefly, by the heathens. So that's the 3 areas that we need to note regarding the persecutions. All right, any thoughts on it before we begin? So let's notice, number 1, the persecution by Bar Kokhba. So I want to draw just a generic picture at first regarding this persecution. The Jews, of course, the temple destroyed at 70, Judaism as we know it from the Old Testament wiped out, but there still was a huge population of Jews around the world, and that Judaism was really Talmudism, that was based on the Talmud. That would be the traditions of the Jewish fathers added with the law, and that became, of course, paramount to traditions of the church fathers, or rather the Jewish fathers. So that was paramount, Talmudism. And so, not only so, but remember in the destruction of Jerusalem, there were a class of Jews that were known as zealots, and they were militaristic in their defense of Judaism. So that still is going to play a big part. Consequently, the Jewish enclave, or a large Jewish population, where the Sanhedrin itself now moved to a place on the western coast of Palestine in the north, and it's a place called Jamnia. And out of this mix arose a man by the name, we don't even know his real name, he adopted this name, Bar Kokhba. Bar means what in Hebrew? B-A-R means Simon Bar Jonah. What does Bar mean? Son of. Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah. Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah. Bar means son of. Kokhba is star. So where did he get the idea? So you might turn in your Bibles. I didn't bring my old here, but it's Numbers 24 and 17. Numbers 24 and 17. So let's look at that passage very quickly. Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, you have. Yeah. Thank you. All right, Numbers 24:17. Now, who's doing the speaking here? Who's doing the talking in Numbers 24? Balaam. B-A-L-A-A-M. Balaam. Balaam is doing the talking. Who's Balaam? Who's Balaam? Who's Balak? Balak hired the man. Balaam was taught a lesson even by a donkey. How did that happen? Well, Balaam was a false prophet, a Qassam. He put himself forward as a priest, as a prophet, but he was actually an eclectic kind of guy. That is, he took in all these different religions. So let's stop and think about this. Not that this is important for the idea of persecution, but just to give the background here. Israel is trying to go into the land of Canaan. They had tried, remember, 40 years previously. They come up to get Kadesh, and then they were repelled because they rejected God. God said, don't go up. They went up. They were beaten. And so now Moses leads them in the wilderness for 40 years. The second time they try to go in, they come up around the bottom of the Dead Sea, and they come up to the north of the Dead Sea, and they're going to cross from the eastern side of the Jordan River, which would be across from the city of Jericho. But before they go, of course, Moses, himself having sinned, he cannot enter himself, begged God to go in, but said no. So Moses is going to stay on this side, but they had fought a number of peoples. They had fought Sihon, the king of the Amorites, Og of Bashan. They had fought these kings, and they had won some territory on the Transjordan side. But there was one people there that really wanted to stop Israel, and that was the Midianites. And the Midianites were led by a king by the name of Balak. Balak wanted to hire, and he did, hired a Qassam, Q-A-S-A-M. That would be a necromancer, a soothsayer, to come and curse the people of Israel. And that soothsayer's name was Balaam. Come curse the people of Israel, because I don't want them to be successful going in. So he takes Balaam, and Balaam's on the way, and the donkey talks to him. Remember the talking donkey. Donkey talks to him, why have you beat me these 3 times? So God says, you go, but you're going to say only what I tell you to say. So he gets up, and he's supposed to curse the people, but instead of cursing, he ends up blessing the people. 1, 2, 3 times. Balak was so disgusted, I hired you to curse the people. Instead, you're blessing them because God took his tongue. And so this is Balaam doing the talking here. So this is chapter 24. This is his 3rd oracle, his final oracle. And this is, we'll start at chapter 24, verse 15. He took up this discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty. Falling down with his eyes uncovered, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall arise out of Israel. It will crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, that would be Edom, and her enemies will be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly. And one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. Here's a king that's in the future. I see him, but not now. He shall arise, and he will crush his enemies, and he calls him the Star of Jacob, out of the Star of Jacob. And this has been, of course, understood, and I think so, a messianic prophecy from time immemorial. The Jews understood it as a prophecy of the Messiah, but they, of course, took it in a very physical way. When the Messiah came and didn't preach a militaristic kingdom, the Jews rejected him, murdered him. So the Jews said, just like the premillennialists today, we want a militaristic, Zionistic Messiah. And here's a man who was in Jamnia who says, I am Bar Kokhba, I'm son of the star. Where did he get the passage? Numbers 24:17. I am the Messiah, and I'm going to fulfill the destiny of the Messiah of the Jewish desire. I'm going to lead in battle. So this is what's taking place. Now, the reason we mention that is because the Jews are in rebellion all over the Roman Empire. Island of Cyprus, they have They take over a bunch of copper mines, and they ended up having big battles there, and 250,000 are slain. Roman emperors have sent the governors in here. They sent governors to Egypt and Alexandria. There's a huge Jewish population there, and Jews are in rebellion. So finally, Bar Kokhba says, I am the Messiah. He calls himself son of the star out of Numbers 24:17, a star of Jacob. Now, the reason I mention that is because when Bar Kokhba became the leader of the Jews in 135, well, actually about 125 AD, one of the peoples that they persecuted mercilessly were, guess who? Your brethren in Christ. They murdered them. They murdered you. They beheaded. They murdered Christians. So they were even furthered by a rabbi who came to the Sanhedrin, who was such an influential Talmudist, and his name was Akiba. This statement comes from Alfred Edersheim in his History of the Jewish People. It's a separate book from others one I've mentioned. So this is Akiba. He reigns from, or is a Sanhedrist from 50 to 135 AD. And here's how he is described. This statement is from F.W. Farrar. It is difficult to believe that he was not actuated because he called himself the one who is pushing forward Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. And he says, Farrar says he was actuated by a hatred of Christianity. So it is difficult to believe that he was not actuated by a spirit of antagonism to Christianity. It may have been partly from his reason that he openly adopted the claims to messiahship put forth by the impostor Bar Kokhba. And we can but hope that he did not inflame the fanatical hatred which made that false Messiah the sanguinary, what does that mean, sanguinary? Bloody persecutor of Christians. Rabbi Akiba pushed forward his claims, and the Jewish Sanhedrin Council, they pushed forward Bar Kokhba, and Bar Kokhba started murdering Christians. And so Christians were persecuted heavily in the New Testament period and immediately thereafter by Jews. And that's what happened with Bar Kokhba's rebellion. But we don't need to go to Bar Kokhba to see it. Let's just go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 for a moment. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul tells us a summary statement of all of his experiences with the Jews. This is so politically incorrect today that people want to excise it out of the Bible, cut it out. So this is starting in verse 13. Or we'll start in verse 14 actually. For we, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God which are in Christ Jesus. For you also suffered the same things of your own countrymen. All right. He's writing to Thessalonians. Where's Thessalonica located? What country? What continent? Okay, we're going to go back to Bible geography next class time. Okay, Ephesus is in Asia. Thessalonica is across the waters, the Aegean Sea. It's close, but it is in Europe. It's in Greece. It is Macedonia, to be exact, and it is on the continent of what? Where is Greece? Europe. Europe. Everybody's like, I don't know. Antarctica? This is the first time that Paul came over here when he preached here, and it was the first time the gospel was preached on European soil. He leaves Asia. That's Asia Minor, today the country of Turkey, leaves in Ephesus. All that over here on the right-hand side of your map, goes over here to across the Aegean Sea and now preaches in Europe. So now he's telling the Thessalonians, he's telling them this. You became imitators of the churches of God which are in Judea. That would be Jewish Christians. For you also suffered the same things of your own countrymen. All right, what are they suffering there? Are Christians being persecuted in Greece? He says they are. You suffered the same things of your own countrymen, that people in Greece. Now then, even as they did, who's they? Your Jewish brethren in Judea, even as they did of the Jews. What about the Jews, Paul, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets. They drove out us. They please not God. They're contrary to all men. They forbid us to speak to the Gentiles that they should be saved, to fill up their sins always. But the wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost, foretelling, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem. So what is Paul saying regarding persecutions? Came at the hands of the Jews. He said the Jews have been contrary to all men. They don't even want to speak the word to Gentiles. You can't read the book of Acts and not come away with the conclusion that it was the Jews who was the chief persecutor of the church, just as it was of our Lord. So Christianity was persecuted by Jews in the New Testament period, in the immediate aftermath of that, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so that's the point. Christianity was persecuted, and that helped, of course, spread the gospel, but at that same time, we're going to see that persecution is going to bring about other things. All right, any questions about that? Any thoughts? All right, let's move to the persecutions that come about from the Roman Empire. And I have a statement here that I want to begin with, which is regarding the Roman Empire and the rights of men. And this is, I thought this was telling because this comes from Augustus Neander. He says, we don't understand how it went in the Roman Empire because the rights of men that we know today that come from where? God. That's why our declaration says they come from God. The rights of men, inclusive of what? What would be the rights of men? Not only life, liberty. What liberty of what? Liberty. Liberty from government oppression. In what ways are we free? Supposedly free. You choose how you want to live. You choose how you want to speak. We are losing those liberties as quickly as I'm speaking those words right now. There are huge investigations in Congress about the curtailing of free speech. Right now, and that's been going on, and everybody knows it. So, the right to live the way we want to live, freedom of speech, freedom of association. We can associate with those whom we wish to associate. We can freedom of worshiping God. All of that is unknown to the ancient Romans. That is not known. They didn't have any concept of the rights of man. Why didn't they have that concept? Because they did not believe that man came from God. That's why. They didn't believe that God made you. You may have come from gods, but the gods were just as wicked as men are. And so you read in the mythology of the Greeks and the Romans, just the most ugly stories that you can imagine. There's no putting man or asking man to come to a standard that is here. They didn't believe that man came from the one God of the universe. They didn't believe that. So when that is the case, there is not going to be rights of men understood. And the Roman Empire did not have it. So that is going to make a big difference. By the way, if our country continues on the trajectory it is in disbelief of God, what is that going to say about the rights of man? It always in history follows that the rights of men are curtailed and then lost. We don't believe that man comes from God. And if we have an atheistic worldview in our country, which apparently we have, and if that's why we have big fights in our country, big arguments and tension, maybe a better way to put it, it's from this. So that's what we have. So rights come from God, life, liberty. Pursuit of happiness would be, what is pursuit of happiness? Property. Property, you have the right to own property. Property rights. Your property is supposed to be sacred and inviolable just as you are. Is that the way we see it today? No, no. They're giving you car tags in Washington, D.C. Say, are those little tags, or air tags put on your car. So when it gets jacked, then you can go find it. Yeah, they're passing out air tags for your car. That's what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's like, we've lost. We don't think about property as being sacred or something that's an extension of my person. But those rights those come from God. So this is a statement of Augustus Neander regarding the rights of men. He says are completely unknown in the Roman Empire, and it's going to have a huge impact on how the Roman government is going to see Christianity. The ideas of the rights of man and general freedom in matters of religion and conscience were foreign to the notions of antiquity. They were first brought to light by the gospel. This is why the gospel has its impact in this direction. When it set forth not a national God, but a God of all human nature. When it, that is Christianity, taught us to recognize man as men and to look on all men as in the image of God. Rome didn't have that. With the same destination, same duties, same rights. When Christianity, that is Christianity, considers man not as a member of one narrow political circle, but is called to citizenship in God's boundless kingdom. And when freeing religion from all essential dependence on external and earthly things, it placed its whole essence in the worship of God in spirit and in truth. What passage is he quoting here? Worship God in spirit and in truth. John 4:24. He's quoting right out of the Bible. That was no concept. The men of antiquity were unable to distinguish between the man from the citizen, and so to attain to a recognition of general rights of man. They didn't have general rights of man or of conscience. Religion was a state matter. How is it a state matter? How did it become a state matter? You're going to worship. What would you worship in the Roman Empire? Caesar. That's right. You would worship Caesar. Caesars were elevated to God's status, sometimes even in their lifetime, usually after they died. But Nero demanded that people worship him, and he cast coins that called him the supreme ruler and God of the universe. Well, that's why it's a state matter. You're going to worship the state. You're going to worship the Caesar, who is a representative of the state. So religion is a state matter. There were only national and state religions, and the laws which related to religion being part of a general civil code, any violation of was considered a violation of the latter. That is, if you violated the religious principles of Caesar, worshiping Caesar, you violate the state. You violate the state because it's all tied up together. This is what our founding fathers found so despicable, because that is the wedding of church and state, when you have both of them together. We have a Christian nation, but that's simply the principles of Christianity that underlie the whole. But to wed the two together and to make one part of the other, that would be a theocracy, and that's how they did it. So when Rome conquered another territory, they would take another god into the panoply, and that would be fine. But what was the problem with Christianity? What was the problem with Christians? What do you think the practical problem of Christians would be? What do you think would be? Exactly. They worship God. Then Romans would say, you can bring those in. You can bring God in here. He's going to worship ours also. We're going to. They said, no, worship one God only. One God. That's it. And His Son Jesus Christ. Not going to worship all these other gods. They couldn't understand that. So that was a state matter, so that's why the Roman Empire began in earnest to persecute Christians, as they did in Nero's time and other times as well. So that's one thing. Any questions on that? Any thoughts about that? I know that's kind of some deep principles. Wow, but that is the track that our founding fathers were on. That's why they insisted, no, we're not going to have religion to be a matter of the state. We're not going to make people go to a church, make people go to worship. Even though there were state churches when the Constitution was framed, there were state churches. The Episcopal Church was a state church in one state and colony, and the Congregational Church in another one, but there was not going to be a national church to which you had to belong and to which you had to pay taxes. It's not going to be that way. So this is where they get these ideas. All right, that's one thing. And here's another thing. I want you to think about the jealous character of despotism. That out of that is going to flow a jealous nature of the emperors. So let's look at Acts chapter 18 for an illustration of how this is going to work. Acts 18. Now this is Paul in Corinth. And while Paul was in Corinth, we had, as elsewhere, the Jews were riled up against him. But the Jews wanted to use, because they're in synagogues, Corinth is, okay, let's go back to geography. Where is Corinth? Where is Corinth? Say again. In Europe, okay, that's the continent of Europe, the country of Greece. It's down on this isthmus, down on the very bottom, below Athens. Corinth is right down here. We didn't get to go to Corinth. That would have been interesting, but at any rate, Corinth is down here. So there are synagogues in Corinth. Paul comes to the synagogues and preaches. They don't have a government surrounding them as in Jerusalem, which would be all Jewish. That's why they're able to drag Stephen out and kill him right away. But they wanted to in other places, but instead the Jews dragged Paul to where? In Acts 18. Where did they take Paul? They took him to a Roman governor. And I want you to hear the conversation. So this is Acts 18 in verse 12, and the year is 51 AD. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, Achaia is Greece. Greece is Achaia, the province of Achaia, Macedonia to the north, where Alexander the Great was from. The Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. Why do you suppose they did that? Why would they bring him before the judgment seat of Rome? Roman governor. Take him. Antagonize. You have to antagonize Paul or the governor. Maybe both. But why? But what would be their desire here to bring him before a Roman governor? What are they going to? They didn't have authority, and what do you think they're going to accuse him of? What are they going to accuse Paul of? Well, okay. Let's see. So they accused Paul. They said, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Law of what? Moses. Okay, contrary to the law. Contrary to the law of Moses. So now they didn't frame it very well here because they're trying to get a Roman governor to step in and protect, because Judaism had a protective status. And so they wanted him to be prosecuted because he was contrary to the law, which would be also contrary to the Roman law. But this is all about, notice this is about worshiping God. Worshiping God, contrary to the law, which would also be against the law of Rome. So when Paul was about to open his mouth, that was to defend himself, Gallio said to the Jews, if indeed it were a matter of wrong or wicked villainy, that is, wrongdoing, a criminal activity, O Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if there are questions about words and names and of your own law, look to it yourselves. I am not minded to be a judge of these matters. This is not my province. I'm not going to do that. So he drove them from the judgment seat. What did the Jews do here? They were so angry. You talk about a volatile people. What did they do? They beat Sosthenes. They grabbed Sosthenes, who had been entertaining Paul. They dragged him in front of the judgment seat right there at the Bema and beat him. How about that? What did Gallio do? Didn't do anything, No concern. He said, you know what? It's about your own matter. So now this is exactly the tack that our government itself should take in matters pertaining to religion in America. But they have not. 25 years ago, a woman withdrawn from at Collinsville, Oklahoma, church withdrew from her, and she was one who committed adultery, and so the church said withdraw fellowship. What happened? Her name was Mary and Gwen. I remember the story. I think it was 1980 something, really. Well, she ended up being on the Phil Donahue show. So that tells you a little bit about it. So she hired lawyers. And the lawyers sued the church at the bar of law and found the church guilty. Because, you know, this is right of privacy. You've violated the rights of privacy, blah, 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 and on and on and on it goes. So the story is very interesting, but the point is that they went to the bar, the law, and prosecuted the church, just the same as right here. When in point of fact, the law should have said, you know, this is a matter about your religion and about what you practice and what you teach. It should not be about, you know, civil code here. But they didn't. They prosecuted the church. And it has changed how the churches of Christ withdraw fellowship. Now, not that many churches do, but they changed it because they said, well, we won't name names. You know, it's just because, you know, okay, we don't want to be liable at law for it. So then she ended up going to the Phil Donahue show because after they lost the suit and everybody in the country, the newspaper writers, I mean, what do you think the population of America, whose side do they take? Her side, obviously, her side. So they invited her to come on the Phil Donahue show. I watched the tape of it. It's very interesting. So they invited, one of my mentors was Garland Elkins at Memphis, Tennessee. He's from a little town in Tennessee, just Tennessee preacher, great man. He knew the Bible backwards and forwards. He could quote it. So he came, and they invited him to come because they said, well, maybe you should have a representative of the Church of Christ from Collinsville come. They said, you know what, we want to get Garland Elkins to go. So Brother Elkins went, and so he came out there on stage. He was sitting there, and so Brother Elkins, he's the one who told us the story. He said, here's how it goes in Hollywood and television and all that. He says they had a black woman come out there and harangue, she was the producer of the show, harangue the audience before anybody was introduced at how ugly the Church of Christ is, how ugly we are, how nasty it was to withdraw fellowship, and we have no right to do it, and she just whipped the crowd up into a frenzy. He said, when I walked out, it was like having a red flag in front of a bull. He said, they're all like, what are you doing? She had whipped them up. See, but all we see is, oh, here's the show, and everybody's in a frenzy against it. But Phil Donahue didn't even ask him to speak. After a while, he was running through the audience. He didn't even introduce Garland Elkins. He introduced Marion Gwynn, her lawyer, and then he didn't introduce Garland Elkins at all. Finally, he was going through the audience, and he went up to one of the Church of Christ members and says, we have a spokesman on the stage. You haven't even introduced him yet. He said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. And he went back up there. This is Garland Elkins, blah, blah, blah. And he says, why do you think, and Garland Elkins just quoted passages. Well, 2 Thessalonians says thus and so. Phil Donahue, okay, the Bible says, all right. But anyway, the whole point is that this is how they set it up against the law, what's going on. And so you might think this is something that's far-fetched from us, but it's not. It's right here with us. So we get letters every year, especially at election time, saying you can't do this, can't do this, can't do that, can't mention this person because that's electioneering, blah, 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 blah. You shut your mouth. No, I'm not going to do that. It's not your place to talk to me about what I should preach and how I should preach it. Anyway, I say all of that to point out that this is not something that's just antiquity. This is common right now, current events. So that's what happens. So we have the rights of men are unknown, the jealous character of despotism. The reason that we have a jealous character like that is because we're drifting in that direction where we have an all-powerful government. So the jealous character of despotism saw Christianity as a threat to the Roman Empire itself. So we have Pliny the Younger, who was a governor of Bithynia, writing to Hadrian, the emperor, and said, hey, I've got Christians over here. I just put a couple of them to death because they wouldn't bow down to Caesar's image and worship it. They said, I'm not sure what to do because we don't have any statutes about this. He said, help me out. Hadrian writes, well, you know, they kind of in a murky area. They didn't know what to do really. But their first response was, kill them, kill them. So that's the jealous character of it. Despotism demands total obeisance, religion of the state, everything. So in Soviet Union, old Soviet Union, They would have churches, but they were all, what? State-run, licensed by the state. You have to apply to the state. What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? If you have anything else that says, hey, you know, this president is not doing well, or this is what you need not vote for, oh boy, that shuts you down right now. That's the way despotism works. So out of that mix is going to come some heavy persecutions against the church. So I'm going to mention just several of these. These emperors is exactly, this is exactly how it went. So just picking up some of the, and I emphasize some of, this is not the entire story, but some of the emperors that began to persecute Christianity. We have, for example, Claudius. Claudius, what did Claudius do according to Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and 2? You're in Acts 18. What did Claudius do? He was an emperor in the 50s. What did he do? Expelled the Jews from Rome. Get out of Rome. Yeah. Okay, that's one. Nero, we've already talked about through the book of Revelation. Nero opened up the first empire-wide persecution and martyred Christians, murdered them right on the streets of Rome, hung them on crosses, and it was just a horrible sight. Domitian, and in the 90s, also persecuted Christians. So also did Nerva, who took over in 96. Trajan, this is interesting. Trajan applied torture to 2 female Christians. And he wanted to obtain from them what he said the truth. Yet all he could learn was that Christians were accustomed to meet on a certain day, and they then sung a hymn of praise to God and Christ. They mutually pledged themselves not to commission of any crime, but to abstain from theft, perjury, and so forth. Now here's something interesting I thought about that. Trajan tortured 2 female Christians, Roman emperor, and wanted to find out what they do. Now why would he be interested in what they did in worship? Because it was everywhere. Scuttlebutt was, well, and Christians are meeting to doing secret things and ugly things in worship. And he tortured these 2 girls and finally put them to death. But you notice how the worship was, by the way? They meet, they have admonition from the scriptures, they sing praises to God. Do you notice something about the worship? How would you call that worship? Simplicity. Simple New Testament worship. And when you go back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, that's all you find. Simple New Testament worship. You need to note that because when we come to 3rd and 4th centuries, things are going to begin to radically change, but that's all they had. She didn't say anything about a pope. These girls didn't say anything about the Roman See, the Holy Roman See. They didn't say anything about encyclicals. Here's what we do. Here's all we do. Take the Lord's Supper, sing praises to God, teaching from the scriptures. That's all we do. He murdered them for it. So that was Trajan. Hadrian persecuted Christians. Bar Kokhba, we've already talked about that one. Here's another one in 161 to 180. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, but he also began persecuting Christians, and we have a lot of information on that. But the Christians were persecuted roundly by the Roman Empire, and then also, of course, and I have a list of Roman emperors where this just continued, but not to belabor the story, but it just continued through the Roman Empire until we get to the time of Constantine in the 4th century, and then it stopped. Now that's how it was. But out of that is going to come some very interesting changes that came about over the churches. Are any questions on that? Any thoughts? Any additions? Yeah, Rabbi. That's right. Now, where did you read that about? Interesting, because this is exactly what we talked about when we talked about the Talmud. That's exactly what's in the Talmud. That Christ was a bastard son. That's what they say. That's what the Talmud reads. That's modern Judaism. And Rabbi Akiba was one of those exactly who said that. Said no, he was a child that was born out of wedlock, and they even say Mary committed adultery with a soldier by the name of Pandera. Yeah, and that's how they say. So it's interesting to point out that you can't deny Christ lived. You can't come to it and say Christ didn't live, because the Jews wouldn't have spent so much vitriol against Jesus Christ and his birth if it was just a myth, figment of someone's imagination. Yeah, it's a sordid way to finish the class, but that's exactly right. But we need to note that. So by the way, that's the Talmud today. That's Talmud today says that. Rabbi Akiba was part of that. Okay. Any other comments? Thank you for that addition. I think that was really important to note. All right. Thank you for your attention, your participation. We'll enter on the changes that became next week.